Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with eyes to eat like comfort food, to disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims? Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace, but ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible, holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make, and folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes, it's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason stay strapped with logic and facts. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason.
Welcome to another exciting episode of Road to Reason, a Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. I'm Paul Sheehan, and today with me we have Robert Penzak.
How are you guys doing today?
We're doing well, Rob.
I was talking to them, but all right.
Okay. So we got some news items we're going to talk about today, and then we're going to go into our topic of the day, which we basically were talking about was how people kind of get into myths, we as a species being prone to it, and how that's affecting and shaping our political world around us today.
Right, and what the secular community could and maybe should do about it.
Exactly, and some of the roles we can play. Exactly. So anyway, PBS did an interesting discussion about, on one of their websites, about the eclipse that we just had, which was really sucked in Virginia, man. It was like I got so psyched on TV. They're like showing everything goes dark. Not here, no, no.
We actually did get to see at our house with the cloud cover and everything. It actually wasn't too bad.
I got to see the fact that it got darker, but actually a friend of mine has this really cool photo where the sun was going through the trees and it was casting a shadow of the crescent on the ground. So that was really cool. You could see it reversed, but I was just like, texting everyone going, I was cheated. I want my money back. I'm complaining to, I'm complaining to management. It's like this totally blows. But the point is, PBS did this article on their website talking about how an atheist saw the solar eclipse and has now decided that there's a God because of it. And I'm like trying to figure out how in the world someone could call themselves an atheist, see an eclipse, and decide that that is proof of God, something that has happened since the beginning of the formation of our universe, or in at least this case the solar system, that it can be predicted with mathematical calculations. We knew it was coming. There was nothing supernatural about this.
Some people come to their atheism by way of a lot of research and study and scientific background and all that methodology. And I guess others happen into it from other circumstances. So maybe this person didn't come to it by way of critical thinking and analysis.
Yeah, he says he was struck with an epiphany. Now I suddenly believe in God, completely believe in God. My question would be, which one?
Yeah. Well, what's funny is he'll probably be accepted by some religious community, because at least if you believe, it doesn't really matter the grounding.
Yeah.
Now it's on the team, I guess.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the news keeps reporting things like this. We had another article, and I guess this is kind of like goes into what our topic will be later about how people arrive at rational decisions. We talked, and you and I had an interesting conversation before the show, and I'll explain what made it interesting. Is there's another article that was done by The Guardian. It says atheists tend to be seen as immoral, even by other atheists. And it goes into one of the primary sentences in here that I focused on was the findings suggest that in an increasingly secular world, many, including some atheists, still hold the view that people will do bad things unless they fear punishment from an all-seeing God. And the position I took on this was that you're not an atheist if you believe that there's a God that will punish people if they don't behave. And you had pointed out that what you believe that this was a case of them saying how other people might misbehave, people who believe in gods, if they don't have a fear. Is that
right? Or even, I think the article is just saying, even if it's talking about atheists, if we all just take God off the table, we know it's fake, just saying it is in human nature to some degree to get away with what you're able to if it improves your status or all the various things. And so I think just what they were saying, factually, the words, I didn't think it was necessarily incorrect. Now, in terms of the study, I'd be curious to know how they decided that, atheists, thought that other atheists were immoral. Like, did they, what countries they studied, what the population was. I'd like to sort of see that data before just signing off on, yes, we atheists think that we're less moral, because I'm not sure that that's the case.
Yeah, they went on to talk about how they basically said if a person was, had some traumatic childhood event, they became a serial murderer, if they were an atheist, was that more likely than someone who was religious? And across the board, they said it was more likely if a person was an atheist, that they would have a tendency to do something like that. And you're correct. This article does not do a good job of giving actual breakdowns of what they're quoting, but that's the interesting point. You and I talked about an article, we came to two totally different ideas about what the article was saying. And we're gonna get into that later in our show today about how people reason things, the way that they approach it, the way that they're reasoning it from where they're standing at that moment may actually be accurate, but there's only necessarily one truth. And the question is really the right questions, the right answers, the data. I know you have some really interesting things to talk about an author who talked about people developing false ideas and how they arrive at them. So we're going to get into that. But I did find it was kind of interesting that I read multiple articles this week that basically are saying that atheists kind of are condemning other atheists. It's kind of like, I mean.
Well, I guess there's a couple points to be made on that.
Yeah.
One is that, we'll both agree that just being an atheist by definition doesn't necessarily say anything about your moral character or fiber, whether you're a good person or not. And the separate thing is that we do see all sorts of rancor within our own atheist and secular community. It's unclear what to do with some of that. Some of it, can simply be egos and the regular human stuff. But what do we do if there's somebody that seems either legally corrupt or ethically that they're doing bad things? How do we police ourselves? Do we police ourselves? Do we just disengage with that person? What's the appropriate approach to take? And a lot of the atheist community does tend to be liberal or progressive, and we tend to consume our own. We don't tend to just set this aside. We tend to tear each other apart, and then we don't have a lot of political power because of that.
And we do a very good job of preaching that we want to be inclusive. And I've seen people that identify as Republicans or conservatives that are atheists, and we tolerate them just long enough to say that we're tolerant, and then we start attacking them. So it's kind of like, and we'll be getting a little bit of that later.
And you see that the people that go out of their way to have conversations with people on the other side, if you have, again, there's a lot of liberal atheists that will talk with people outside of that immediately get lambasted, and it's like the whole community, or not the whole community, some people will ignore any nuance in the conversation, and sometimes it seems really purposeful. Like somebody can have a discussion, say, I disagree with you on this, and I think this is wrong, I think it's harmful because of this, but the mere fact of speaking with them and having that conversation, some people consider it's, treason to go and speak to the other side, whereas other people think that that's a good way to expose the flaws in somebody else's arguments, actually to have an informed discussion with them on both sides. But without that ability to have a nuanced conversation, a lot of things break down. And that doesn't mean that, I don't think you should necessarily give a platform to, a lot of people that are in hate groups and just taking that opportunity to say nasty, bad things. That's different than having somebody who just disagrees with you and might have reasons that you can discuss, where that is helpful to all society, just to have those intellectual exchanges.
Well, I agree, and we're going to get into that in our show. But to your point, which leads me to my last article, we need as a community to be aware of what can happen, because we can completely wind up mimicking the way religions treat people that don't go along with their ideologies. And the last article we've been monitoring on the show here, Road to Reason, Pakistan, which is becoming increasingly repressive against atheists and non-Muslims. We've been seeing a trend of this in the news as of late. And a Pakistani school has now just dropped their plans to sing John Lennon's Imagine after accusations it encourages atheism. A school in Pakistan canceled their plans to sing Imagine, a world-famous song from 1971 by John Lennon, after complaints that the song encourages atheism. Pupils at a local grammar school in, well, I don't have the city here, that's funny. Basically, a liberally inclined private institution was basically forced to back out of singing this anthem or the song because a Muslim cleric in that country had basically decided that he was going to protest this on social media and with the local authorities. And I think it speaks volumes of what can happen to a community when only one point of view is allowed and people are threatened by diverse points of view. And I want to make sure that our community does not fall prey to that. And, you know, we talk about how bad religion is, but we are human beings, and we're always one step away from behaving like that ourselves if we don't keep in mind that that's something I just think is a manifestation of human nature. We don't want to be told we're wrong. We don't want somebody shattering our beliefs. We don't, you know, we take comfort in them. So it's easy to condemn religion because we as atheists and skeptics have identified the problems with religion. But the problems with religion, I would suggest, are largely inherent in us as a species, which we're going to be getting into a little more when we come back from our break. And with that, it is time for our public service announcements. Oh, and you had a quick joke.
All right, if we don't cut away, we'll give our quick joke. So it's not exactly a joke, but I really love the moment, the picture showing Donald Trump, our anti-science, anti-vax, birther, conspiracy theorist president, staring up at the eclipse because who believes in that science stuff anyway? Paul did note that may have been a little misleading. He may have just glanced up at it, so we'll see if he burned any.
Yeah, he did eventually put glasses on, but he may have been doing that because it was stylish, not because it was science-based.
But I thought it was comical anyway, so we'll see you back here in a couple of minutes.
All right.
When I was younger, I didn't want to admit I had a serious disease. Because of my diabetes, I lost the sight in my left eye. Misconceptions continue to surround this monster public health issue. But the simple truth is, diabetes can often be prevented and complications avoided. You're not alone. Understand the realities of diabetes and know that you can manage it and lead a full, active life.
There's an alarming trend in the world today. Everywhere you go, people are saying that cinema is dead. But cinema is not dead. My name is Count Simon Gauntley, and on my television program, Count Gauntley's Horrors from the Public Domain, I make it my mission to resurrect forgotten film classics. I promise to dredge the sewers and ford the stagnant streams of film history to ensure that no film is truly lost to the ages. Count Gauntley and FPA, keeping cinema alive! Alive! Alive!
Well, even though Joseph's been gone 18 months, we've made the decision to keep all his things as they were when he was here last. I finally just packed his toothbrush away like 6 months ago. It had been sitting on the counter in the bathroom. And I was cleaning the bathroom one day and I just thought, okay, it's time to put the toothbrush in the medicine cabinet.
So, I just moved in with this family and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week, the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait. Look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
All right, welcome back. I want to give an update on that joke. Our staffer, Brian, who's running the technical equipment, just informed me that it was a staff person that kept reminding Trump not to stare at the sun, so he is indeed the anti-science legend that we think he is. I want to jump to 2004. I mentioned that journalist Ron Suskind had released a quote from what turned out to be Karl Rove, also known as Bush's brain, that was disparaging to the reality-based community that believes solutions emerge from a judicious study of discernible reality. So what Rove said was this: "That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be just left to study what we do." Now, in the reality-based community, that was a very problematic statement because there is reality outside of us. And it's important that we grasp that so we can set good social policy, environmental policy. You know, the more we understand about how the world actually works, hopefully the better decisions we make. So more recently, Yuval Noah Harari, who's an Israeli historian, has released two bestsellers, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, and Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. And he points out that 70,000 years ago, we were just another animal out there not making much of an impact on Earth, no different than anything else. And now here we are, ruling the Earth, running the Earth into the ground perhaps, but really the dominant species. And we have to ask, why did that happen? And what he notes is that we humans are the only species that can cooperate flexibly on a mass scale. So there are some insects that can work together on a mass scale, but they're not very flexible about it. One of the jokes that he made was the bees can't decide to get rid of the queen and have a democratic society instead. They can cooperate in a certain manner, but they have no flexibility. And what allows us to have that mass flexibility is we have these shared fictions that we all believe in or agree to believe in. And he's not just talking about religious mythologies there, although that's a very obvious case in point where we have factually incorrect systems that have dominated the world and that billions of people believe in. But he talks about human rights as a construct that out in the Serengeti, human rights didn't particularly exist. This is something that we come to believe, that we should have the right to education or health or whatever it is that we've decided. That's just something that we agree upon as a society. Money, nation states, corporate personhood, these are all just shared fictions that we may or may not believe in. One of the things that we're facing now is we have such a divided country that you have people on the right believe in one set of facts, people on the left believe in their set of facts. And what do we do when we believe, when we have such diametrically opposed understandings of the world? How do we continue to communicate?
Well, these are great questions because, for instance, it boils back largely to experience for me as to seeing how other people prey on those differences. I think there's necessarily a third side, and that's a real question because you talk about how we're the only species that's flexible. Well, sometimes we find ourselves in places where we're not flexible. And that's where real danger happens. I, for instance, do a lot of hiking, backpacking, camping, things of that nature. And to the article's point is, I do like what's called ultralight, where I carry next to nothing with me. And I always find it funny how you get people who draw religious experience from nature, because like the guy with the eclipse, because when you're out there in the wild, I actually feel just the opposite. I get a sense that nature just does not care. It's like you wake up, you don't wake up. You're something else's meal if you don't wake up. This is the way it works. And human beings have carved them for themselves out of that. And when we look at politics in this, I think a lot of what drives people are the things, the right, the left, nationalist, ultranationalist, leftist, communist. The things that drive us all are fundamental and the same. You know, it's the need to feel secure, the need to feel provided for, the need to actually be provided for, the need to be able to provide for ourselves, protect our families, sense of fairness, you know, that we're being treated fairly, that we have equality. I think these are things that are kind of innate in our species, you know, because we are evolved. I mean, a lot of the myth and stuff about how we achieve those things is something that I think what you're talking about is what affects people, and I think it's how we as a species winding up in wars and having religious disputes and political fights, people killing each other, you know, or running each other over in the streets with cars. And it's going to be a real challenge, and I know one of the things we talked about for this episode is talking about how the secular community can start trying to play a role in trying to bring things back to logic and reason base against emotion and myth. And it's a real challenge.
Although, like, you know, even for those people who try to study critical thinking and try to be careful thinkers and all of that, a lot of the time we're still very driven by emotion and intuition, and then we use our rational processes to justify it. Hopefully we do get to build in that thing where we realize we have our own biases, so we want to check ourselves, we want to double check the facts, we want to make sure we're not just looking at our particular source that says what we say so we always like it. You know, hopefully we do get to the point, and critical thinking will teach you this, to go and be more careful, and that you feel some sense of responsibility to the truth. So I think one of the only ways we can get past this, you know, a very divided country and get past our own biases is that, you know, if our goal, if our pride is that we are always as accurate as we can be, and if we screw something up, we take pride in saying, I screwed this up, this was the data I had before, this guy sent me this article, I read it, I checked it out, it looks legitimate. If we sort of take pride, not that we've become a terrible flip-flopper, but that we're open to the new data, then we can start to move in the right direction, and we can also have more nuanced conversations. You could say, you know, Rob, I don't think that's right on that point. I understand what you're saying, I think is wrong. Take a look at these things. We're not in a fight now. And I can say, well, I think I'm right because of this. You take a look at these articles. We both agree to read each other's sources and then come back and talk again. That at least gives us a way to move forward. And even if we don't come to agree totally, to have a conversation, a productive conversation about it.
I agree. And one of the things that is a challenge is how far does someone away from you on the political spectrum to the point you can tolerate them to do that? You know, we had talked about, like, okay, what if you got somebody who just hates black people? Can't stand them, thinks that they're the scum of the earth. But the person totally supports, say, a woman's reproductive rights. Do you tell the person, I can work with you on the reproductive rights, but let me be clear that I will always call you out on the other thing, in, you know, in a manner that's respectful and challenging and whatever. Do we as a society benefit from, you know, building the broadest possible coalition we can on things that move us forward in some areas, or do we section that person off where they become radicalized and they try to draw in more people to their side of view? Because what they're going to do is they're going to look for solidarity where they can find it because they can't find it with you, and they start pooling a larger extreme. You know, these are things that we have to look at.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question because I would be reluctant to give somebody a platform for them to espouse things that I think are harmful. Now, you're right, if you bring them on and you spend the first part challenging and saying, now, we'll get to this other stuff in a minute, but you've said these things that I think have absolutely no basis, they're harmful, they're bad, and you forcibly talk about that stuff, that's a little different. You know, I have seen some shows where, you know, they might just give somebody a platform, nod as they say some things that seem ridiculous, and then the viewing public might tend to think, oh, this guy that I sort of like must sort of agree with that, or at least not be challenging it, so maybe that's more reasonable than I thought. And, you know, the way people tend to think is usually, well, my teammates think this way, so that's probably right, and they give it a lot more credence, as opposed to studying every single argument in intimate detail and always coming to their own decision. That's just, that would be an ideal in some sense, but it's not practical, and it takes a lot of time. You know, to fact check everything takes forever. You can only do it on so many things.
And we live in a culture which does not foster people being analytical and going back and looking at the data and the research. We live in a culture that fosters he who yells the loudest must be right. I think we have a president that can largely attest to that.
The person who's a decider and the person who's really authoritative, instead of waffling like we talked about scientists, will start to rely on probability and hedge their answers as they should and say, well, in this circumstance, it's 90% likely from what we've seen that it will come out this way, but there's always a chance of this. Whereas then you'll get somebody who's, I'm the decider, this is how it works, or these guys are, you just make these blanket statements, and a lot of people that aren't particularly analytical are like, wow, he was really firm, that guy's got to be right, because,
And I just think, that's almost the thing. I think it's like innate in our species, the alpha male kind of thing. People, it's kind of like, they see that as a leadership quality. And we were talking prior to the show about how quickly the human race has gone from what is almost a hunter-gatherer to farming. Go back 3 generations where people are 100 years old. We're dealing with no electricity, no airline. We had wooden ships that sailed. People were starting to hunt whales to extinction at that early point. It's been the last 100 years. We have the Industrial Revolution, electricity, radio, mass communications, and now we're already at a point where we're looking at artificial intelligence. As our species really even at a point where it can catch up and change with the reality of technology, because that's the thing. Technology doesn't care about logic. I mean, it is logic. It operates independent whether you believe that the computer has its evil spirit in it or not. It's going to do what it does.
Yeah, and I think there's a simple answer to that question is no. We certainly cannot evolve in time to fix some of the problems that we're going to be facing. So, evolution, first of all, it relies on, usually natural selection, although we can certainly do that artificially, but it takes numerous generations where it's picking up these slight benefits, and so it will accumulate those traits.
Right.
People that study existential risk, we've had Phil Torres on previously, but there's a whole group of people that study that, and they put our odds of humanity going extinct in the next 100 years at roughly 20–25%. In 100 years, in the lifespan of somebody born today, they think there's maybe a 1 in 4 chance that humanity will be extinct, if they're long-lived. So we don't have 10,000 years, and certainly not 500,000 years, to sort out this thing that we have such an influx of data.
Yeah.
And you have people that prey on that. And you've talked about how people can be really predatory. So if you flood somebody, let's say you put out a news item every single day on whatever you want the news to focus on instead of maybe what a real important story is, you can actually swamp people, and we can talk about why the media plays into that. But if you give people so much data, like they did, I think, in the paper chase, where you flood somebody, here's 30,000 pages, you have 5 hours, and if you find the nugget, then maybe you can fix this. People can't sift through all the data, and nowadays, with technology exploding, we have vastly more data than even the most educated person can possibly master. So you get super specialists that know a tremendous amount about their little spot.
So it looks like we have a caller. Go ahead, from Fairfax.
Hi.
Hey, Don.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep. Yep, go ahead, please.
All right. Paul, I think you mentioned some sort of person who hates black people but loves women's rights, especially on abortion. Does that person exist? I'll take my answer off the air.
You would think that that's an easy question to answer and say no, but the fact is I've run into people like that. I ran into a guy on the internet, and I did something I was actually ashamed of. I actually blocked the guy, and I don't believe in blocking people. I believe in engaging them. It just became something. It wasn't like I was disgusted and I wanted to hurt him. It's just I just couldn't handle it. And I admit, emotionally, I just couldn't deal with it. The guy was against religion for the harm it causes, pro women's rights. I actually got involved with him because he was fighting against Scientology and their abuses. And then he went on about how black people had it better under slavery, and that, and so to answer your question, Dante, is I have actually run into people out there. You're correct, it's not common, but whenever you think, you're talking about the human race, whenever you think you can't find some model out there.
Yeah.
There'll be somebody out there who has that whacked out point of view.
But statistically, I think you're right that there's a group of sort of liberal beliefs that tend to travel together, and Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his book. And so it is unusual. Usually, if you know one or two key factors about a person, then they line up on the whole political spectrum of that. And it doesn't mean never, and there can always be contextual things. And with you can always have a circumstance that creates somebody that strays from the typical liberal or conservative. But
and these things morph over time, though, because when you talk about Democratic Party, everybody thinks, oh, these people are supporting civil rights. Well, the Democratic Party is founded off some of the most racist political camps in this country's history. I mean, the Dixiecrats, Republicans were the ones that were largely responsible for, pushing for emancipation. So these roles kind of feel like they reverse.
Well, they very much did flip when there was a very conscious decision about we're going to lose the Southern white vote for the next generation, but we're going to push, civil rights was a decision, I think, by the Democratic Party with Johnson.
But it also, over time, the actual attitudes of people weren't just so nefarious. They actually started shifting. It was like, I think the base of the Democratic Party, not necessarily the leadership, I think probably is more concerned about race relations than the Republicans who initially pushed for emancipation, which now seem to be very regressive on that. So I do agree that politics in this country, there does tend to be some polarization as to what camps people fall in, but that does not speak as to whether any individual argument is correct in those camps. And I say this not because I'm pushing an agenda, I'm saying this is a topic that I'm very familiar with, is the issue of the Second Amendment. It's also this thing where you can actually have 2 points of view that are right. The question then becomes, well, what is it that we as a society want? Okay, I run into people who are anti-Second Amendment. They think no guns should be allowed in our society by civilians. And do I really think that these are people who hate constitutional freedom and want to strip Americans of their rights? I don't think so. I think that there are people who actually care about other people, who don't want to see people killing each other. The problem I have is that by pushing legislation, that's what they wind up doing. On the other hand, I see people who think the answer for everything is a gun. And think that they can't live without a gun, and it certainly think that the opposite about people who are anti-Second Amendment. They think that they're the worst thing, that they assault the Constitution. But I also see within them people who care. They want to see people to be able to protect themselves. They see a woman who's 180 pounds. She wants to protect herself from a 280-pound man, who's beaten her up in the past, etc. So these are the things where I go back to, well, who really benefits from galvanizing us being at each other's throats? I don't see either one of those two people as being inherently irrational. I think where they're coming from, and as you talked about, when you have a particular news outlet, that takes a point of view and just day in and day out, day in and day out, day in and day out, this other group is bad, the out group is bad, the in group is good. No wonder we're ready to kill each other down.
Yeah. Well, and it gets much harder to think through, again, having a nuanced conversation about gun rights and gun control and the risks and who really gets hurt and what kind of safety training should you get. It's much easier to, okay, my team says this. So if the NRA, there's clearly people that sell guns that have a vested interest in keeping people in fear and selling lots of guns. I know we'll probably be somewhat different on this, but if you take that as a given that in the capitalist system, there are groups that just benefit, whether it's right or wrong. They benefit from selling guns or from selling whatever it is. Doesn't have to be guns. If they have a huge influence on our political system and the rules that get made, you'll then find, let's say that they're paying the politicians to make sure that their product stays on the market. The politician now, who needs that funding so they can win their next election, has a vested interest in agreeing with them and pushing that legislation forward. So they start kind of saying things and pushing things that aren't in the public interest. And if we have a voting democracy, it means they have to use rhetoric and propaganda to convince the voters. And again, I want to take this off gun control. I'm not really speaking about that in particular. You have a political system that relies on propaganda, and you have, we talked about the corporate media is very much bought into this. So if you have a corporate media and you have a corporate-owned political system, then the information that the voters get, whether they're on the left or the right, is generally going to serve those, those corporate interests.
Yeah,
and it makes it hard to have, unless you have people that try to go to the actual studies, which is almost nobody. It gets hard to have a nuanced conversation and figure out, well, here's a reasonable way to approach this particular product.
Well, I think a lot of the studies actually do exist. I think the problem is camp number one misrepresents the study to say it gives them a position that it really doesn't, and camp number two wants to bury the position because the study because it doesn't support the position that they want. And and like when you take groups like the NRA or any group, I think that ultimately you have to look at, is it really, because, and again, I don't want to do the whole gun control thing. The NRA is made up of, it's the second largest organization in the United States. It's 4.5 million members. So it is really a representation organization. They do take feedback and they go back and they push for politicians to vote the way that their membership wants them to. The real question is the data solid on the issues of gun control, Second Amendment, et cetera? Are we actually having an honest discussion, like what we're talking about with the Confederate statues down in South? I'm of the opinion that you can put a statue up, take it down if that's what the majority of the population wants. What I actually care about is the actual honest discussion about, for instance, if you want to take down all statues because of slavery, then you have to take down Lincoln's, or not Lincoln's, oddly, he freed the slaves, but he was not an abolitionist and said as much. But Washington owned slaves, Jefferson owned slaves. Robert E. Lee was actually somebody who supported the South in slavery. These are the conversations people don't want to have because of the way that our politics in this country are run, which are, as you mentioned, want somebody with short answers to the point, they know what they're talking about. But then I got to go back to the whole capitalism thing, which is that as long as we're at each other's throats, we're not at theirs. And the things I keep thinking of is, like, I see these poor white guys down in Charlottesville, and I mean poor isn't financially, because I don't think these guys are rolling in dough. They don't see that the black guy that they're pointing at lives in the same neighborhood as they do, has got the same employment issues that they do. They think, because they've worked hard, and I'm sure they're hard workers, they're supposed to have a piece of the pie, like the 1%. That's what they're told. If I just bust my tail, I can own a piece of the pie. So if it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. And who do I get to blame? I can't blame the system that I aspire to be a part of. So if I can't blame the system that I aspire to be a part of, it must be some outside group's fault. And who's the outside group?
Yeah, so politicians have played upon scapegoating, for probably almost all of human history. And it's funny, it's something like, again, even in our own communities, it's an easy mistake to make, to project your own, or hopefully, your ethics, if you're going to assume, okay, we're both going to be rational partners, we're both working toward just fixing the problem. Sometimes it's a mistake to do that because other people might have their agenda, and what they really care about is their agenda.
This is true.
And so we see this, with whether it's capitalism or it's retaining political power, whether it's elites that want to preserve their, whatever their life is. You can usually rationalize and justify things that are bad for humanity, and people do it routinely. And so part of, I think, critical thinking, we need to sort of acknowledge and factor that part in, where we don't simply pretend that we're going to have a rational discourse, we're both going to honestly put all the facts on the table and have an honest discussion. We have to force some transparency into it, realizing that your own side and the other side both have, if you have an agenda that you're fighting for, you may not be being honest. And it's very different to have a personal conversation with two people and to have two groups that are fighting over a piece of the pie, if that's what they think it is.
Yeah.
And so we do have to acknowledge that emotion comes into it and that biased interests come into it. Critical thinking tries to get you, to have an honest conversation, to say, here are the flaws in my argument, here are the problems that I'm presenting that I haven't worked past, but I still think this is how it works, and then here's all the supportive information. You don't see politicians doing that generally.
No, you don't.
Other than if they have to do it to pretend that they're being fair, but that's just not how our system works. And it's very hard. I think that's one of the big problems we need to solve is getting out of the mindset of, it's a combat and the better idea wins, in terms of actually just aiming toward the truth somehow. And I'm not sure how we get there from where we are.
I'm not 100% sure either, but things I am convinced of is that our community as a whole is probably better equipped to do that because of just the way we approach things in general. What I am also concerned about is because we are human beings and we have our own infighting in our community, is how we go about not getting caught up in that. We've seen, people being kicked out of our community because, Richard Dawkins tells a bad joke, or, he has an unpopular point of view with a certain camp, so he gets deplatformed, or, I've taken a very, I think, I use the word progressive attitude towards Steve Shives. I've always said if Steve Shives ever wants to come back on our show, he's welcome to come back on. I don't approve of his behavior going after people. And Steve did something recently that I got a major issue with, which is he basically was trying to get people deplatformed, and he was being dishonest. I mean, he's basically calling people Nazis and fascists and women-hating rape apologists and stuff like that. And it's because he's decided that is what they are because they don't agree with him. And the instinctual thing is to want to burn someone like that. It's, wanting to bury them. That's a sense of justice. They need to pay for what they've done, which is what he's doing. He's offended at something. I think we have to, as a community, start developing tools as a community, to lead by example, which is that, to say, I don't need to burn that person. I don't need to destroy them. I don't need to make them sorry that they ever lived. I'm going to do that thing that I call solidarity, which is I'm going to work with people where I can. I'm going to tell people outright that what they've done is wrong and that I don't agree with them in other areas, and I'll make it publicly known and say that I still will work with that person where I can. Mm-hmm. I think as a species, we have to be able to bring people back in the fold when they're ready to be back in the fold. We need to foster an environment where if we ever find ourselves outside of the fold, that things like shame and guilt don't come into it, and we start digging our heels in. I know people who were religious that knew their religion was baloney, mm-hmm. but couldn't bring themselves to step away from it because the shame associated with it.
Well, shame and being ostracized from your community also has a lot of just practical repercussions, and I think I like the idea of tying evolution into a lot because we are, our brains, our thoughts, that all really does always tie back into evolution. Mm. So when you lead, if you forfeit your security, we don't survive well as an individual being. Mm. We really need our community, we need our family, we need, the financial support. You want when you look at how genes, in their struggle, just to anthropomorphize a little bit to get into the next generation, we need a lot of things to go right. And if we're on our own, the odds of propagating don't work well. And so we've sort of our mental capacity has developed in a way that we want to stay part of our community. So if that means believing a lie, mm-hmm. then that's a tiny price to pay if that gets your genes into the next generation. So it's a setup for us to sort of behave in ways that we know are not, we're not comporting with factual accuracy. Mm-hmm. Also, if we realize, hey, this person is a cheat, but they're successful, and if I partner up with them, this is going to help me in the long run. Nobody's watching, I'm not going to get caught. I'm going to do it. And maybe you don't go through all of that quite consciously, but there is stuff acting in the background to sort of nudge you in that direction. It takes very purposeful decisions to try not to do that or try to be self-aware. Are you acting in a way that's still ethical, still rational? I don't know the specifics of the kind of Steve Shives thing, but as a general rule, I think there's a couple of things you have to factor in. One is that people have their own agenda. So if his agenda or anybody's agenda is just to get at the facts, then you might be able to have a very good conversation and sort of fix things and come to understanding. If it's that, hey, conflict sells, I need my views to get my ads. Again, I'm not talking about him in particular.
Yeah, I was about to say, because he blocks everybody. So,
so we know that kind of combat draws eyeballs. And so if people are looking, hey, I need to generate money so I can support my family, now they don't care about it. They're looking for an argument. They're looking to be inflammatory. And that's a totally different situation. And you have to assess what their agenda is to have a rational way to interact with them.
In his case, he's actually been consistently losing viewers. I think he's just become ideologically entrenched, and I think that his agenda is to not be wrong. And this, this is, I hate to use the examples of Nazis in anything, but I've been doing a lot of reading lately on the war crimes tribunals that were going on after World War II, and I look at like Roman history and how they would bring countries into the fold that they conquered and the things that they would do as well. One of the smart things that the Allies did was they held Nazis accountable for what they did, but there were also like people like Albert Speer. There's no question the man was involved in genocide. He helped. He was aware it was going on. He helped be involved in forced labor, but he also wound up was spared the gallows. He had remorse for what he had done. He had he'd taken an active position that his society as a whole needed to take accountability. You can't just blame everything on Hitler. It was the entire German people needed to answer for allowing someone like Hitler to come to power and stay in power. This is part of Hitler did not take over through a fascist coup. He was elected. Yeah.
I'm just smiling because our country should be paying attention right now.
We should be paying attention right now. But there's this galvanization in our country that would just be like, no, Spears has to be killed. He's like, and it's like, it allowed Germany a way to to understand that they didn't have to dig their heels in. You see, it is victor's right. The victor is, killing off everybody. They're only right because they won. So they allowed, diversity in Germany and the German leadership to exit the Nazi era. And it's a hard thing to stomach that Albert Speer didn't wind up getting a noose. But at the same time, you look at how quickly Germany went through a denazification process. And sometimes it means you have to look at the bigger picture. You have to look at, do you want the blood right here and now? Or do you understand the impact that will have on the broader population seeing itself as a victim? Because what happened in World War I and the way that the Allies treated Germany definitely contributed to World War II. And the Romans learned that you could conquer a country, but you let people keep their gods. You didn't crush the population outright. You let them hold some semblance of identity. And
well, then without artificial means, eventually those people that are living in the same area within a few generations are going to be coming together and working together and part of the society.
Exactly.
Now you can sustain that through all sorts of things if you want to keep a class down or certain people down. But absent that, if and I think it's, I don't know if ironic is the right word or a strong enough thing, but when you see the German reaction to what's going on here in America with Trump, there's a whole fallacy about ever talking about Hitler. But when you look about our authoritarian shift, and when you see them having to lecture us, like, what on earth are you guys thinking?
Never mind, we're spying on all their politicians anyway. The NSA get caught spying on them, so that alone should tell people what they need to know about where our country is going. But the point I'm making is that as a secular humanist community, we can learn from those types of historical examples, which is that we don't need to micromanage and control every point of view in our own community. You can have somebody that you think is sexist or who isn't racially sensitive, but they're not, it's like, I've run into this. I'm from an older generation, and sometimes people think I'm sexist or whatever. I don't see myself that way, and I sure as hell would stand up against something that I saw that I thought was sexist. But there are people that just want to go after you for the sake of going after you, and a lot of times these people themselves are not intellectuals. They're not studied.
Well, and again, that can be. It can be an honest reaction that they think you crossed the line, they think you're harmful, and therefore, or, I've seen this and spoken to people about this against some of the people in leadership. If you're the guy that goes after Dawkins or Sam Harris or Peter Godin, there's all sorts of people you can go after. Sometimes you might have a valid complaint and you can have a nuanced discussion. Other times you don't, and a lot of people lift stuff out of context, ignore somebody's career of fighting for women or for liberal values, and then take a quote and take a portion of the quote. And that's really dishonest. And I think that's something we need to try to call out when we see it, and not just be a bystander. I think you had told me about, and I'm blanking on his name, the historian, you can't stay neutral on a moving train, in front of Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky.
No, but it's his sort of a colleague. I'm just blanking on his name right now. But you really need to take an active role in shaping things, and when you see an injustice, most people don't do anything and most people don't say anything, and it often has a cost. And so you have to decide, if you're the one person that sticks your head up, you're going to get in trouble. If as a society we had a lot more people trying to be honest, trying to speak the truth, if we do that as a culture within our own community, then you have a lot more cover and protection. If 30 people hear something said and they all speak up and say, that's not what he said, that's not what he meant, what about this, what about that, that's a very different reaction than an auditorium, somebody makes an accusation, nobody speaks up or one person speaks up, and then the whole audience walks away thinking, wow, I guess he did that terrible thing.
This is true, but there's also a danger in people speaking up who aren't educated on stuff. They can be incensed by what they see. Like, give you an example, the wage gap thing, okay? There's a lot of debate going on, but the concern that I have is when we hear the wage gap, most people think women just don't make as much as men because of sexism. What a lot of the data shows is that when they're in the same field, they do. That, women, though, however, don't tend, and it is open for discussion as to why they don't go into STEM field as much, and there's schools of thought on that. But the idea is that, if there's a male doctor and a female doctor and they both have tenure at a hospital and they both, do the exact same job, that they're roughly making about the same amount. So,
and I don't know the data.
Okay. Well, this is, and that's fine, and that's fine to say that. And I'm not giving you specific data. I'm giving you a general understanding that I have of it. The point that I'm making, though, is then someone comes out and they say, no, it is this. Well, then someone comes along and disproves them, and they really have hurt the issue where it does matter. Because now the person who says that there absolutely is a wage gap has been disproven, but there may be wage gap elements that you do want to focus on that are relative and real, but because the person who championed it has been dismissed, they've hurt the overall bigger picture. So,
and that's a problem in our culture, that expertise is really largely being discounted nowadays.
Yes.
And I think part of that problem is that we have so much dishonesty in the culture. So you might have, if 95% of the academic scholars have studied whatever issue, and there really is large agreement on it, that can be well argued, you can articulate it, you can lay out the facts, you can always find one or two other people to be the contrarian. And if our news media says, hey, we always need a debate, so here's one person for side A and one person for side B, now you have two experts saying diametrically opposed things, and the lay public has no idea what to do with that, and so they'll generally just stick with whatever their tribe says, whatever their team generally feels. So if you're a liberal, then yes, wage gap is a problem. If you're a conservative, then no, it's not a problem. You just go that way. So part of the problem is our tendencies to lean one way or the other. Another huge part, I think, is the media, that we don't no longer do much in-depth reporting, because it's much easier to just throw out sound bites, not pay journalists, and there's not a reward for it. It's like, you do better off preaching to the choir. So if I'm going to be on a liberal show, I'm going to say all the stuff liberals want to hear. If you're on a conservative show and you're a host, you say all the stuff they want to hear, and then you're popular in that community because there's so little overlap. Not many people are watching, what is some independent, middle of the road, just honest news broker.
Democracy Now! That's a plug to you, Amy Goodman. This is interesting, Rob, because effectively, as secular humanists, we see the problem, that's what's going on. So the question is, how do we address it? And for instance, I tend, as a secular humanist, to care about race issues, gender issues, things of this nature. And I think our community has to be very focused, because of the infighting that we've seen, that when we wish to push an agenda on that it's facts-based and we're able to articulate it, not shame somebody for not sharing that opinion or just instantly going along with it and labeling them. And I think our country, the way it's headed, is actually going to be in more need of secular humanism than it ever has. And our communities are going to have to start really focusing on how do we handle disagreements within our own community, move past, learn to live with people that we don't agree with and work with them on issues that we can, while not, and finding ways of also making sure that people don't think that we associate with the negative side of what they're pushing. But we're not going to be able to do it alone, and we are going to need the broadest coalition that we can. I don't want our community to wind up mimicking what we've seen going on in the political sphere between the Republicans and the Democrats, liberals and conservatives. I've said it that I think working class people on the right and left, the things that drive them are the same, but it becomes irrelevant when they're willing to kill each other over the myths that they built around their own camps.
That goes back to kind of what Yuval Harari, where he says we create these fictions and that we believe. And right now we have a country that believes two very divergent fictions, and the two sides don't meet, can't communicate well together, and it's really leading to intractable problems because they never have those conversations of how can we help. So if one of our problems is wealth inequality, where we have 50% of people who have essentially nothing, you would think that they could unite on that, and you would think that it's a humanist cause, it should cross all sorts of boundaries, and so we should ask, why isn't that being addressed? And I think we both agree that there's a lot of purposeful stuff keeping those sides apart. I don't think either one of us is a big fan, I'll speak for myself, of the capitalist system, and when you really do have people with a vested interest of taking as much as they can get. It's not a humanist system.
No, it's not.
So capitalism can do some good things. It can drive the economy, it can expand the pie for everybody, but it's certainly a myth about the rising tide lifting all boats. We're not setting up to try to do that. We're not trying to share the wealth. We have people that make more in a day than people make in a year, and acting like there's some equity to that. And I think it's pretty apparent to everybody involved that that's not okay. And then the problem is, how do they channel that hatred? If you can't get, or that frustration, if you can't fix the system, you just end up fighting against the person nearest you that you can get above them at least.
Well, we want to hear your all's points of views in our comment section on YouTube. Please let us know. We'd like to have more discussions about this. I certainly think that this is something our community needs to continue to engage on, and to start developing some solid platforms on having our community inject itself into the broader political spectrum in America to make change. I don't want to be that 20% of a species not making it kind of opinion there, but I think the best hope for humanity is a secular humanist one. And with that, I think we're about out of time, Rob.
All right. See you next time.